Do you know the saying, be careful what you wish for? Well, I'm sorry, Pat, but you kind of brought this one on yourself. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me doing something book adjacent, because I am still somewhat under the weather and can't really focus enough on a book related video, so the Chuck Tingle one will have to wait until tomorrow or so. But luckily, Pat from Book Chat with Pat tagged me with the A Reader's Favorite Songs tag that was created by, I think, another bibliophile, and yeah, I'll tag the stuff down below so you know what it is. It's a very, very open tag, which just means, yeah, list a bunch of songs that are, you know, favorite songs or whatever, and let the reader, let the watchers, the viewers, and everyone decide how they relate to your reading. And I've kind of done that, and the problem that, I don't know how many of you are aware of that, but like, yeah, music is a big deal for me. Like, I've probably, there were definitely times in my life where music was more important than reading. It kind of oscillates between those two things, and they often intersect in the weirdest ways possible. So, yeah, this is probably going to go really long. Pat listed like 8 songs, and I tried to keep it short. I've narrowed it down to like 12 songs, and there's still so much more that I could have put in there, but at some point, I guess it's just too much. So I decided to come up with, you know, 12 songs that sort of cover sort of my musical evolution from like a kid to where I'm now in a lot of ways. And there will be, you know, direct connections to stuff that I'm reading that are just like very, very obvious. But I think they say a lot about like who I am in general, and that does reflect on like what I like and how I read and what I read and how I engage with the world and with myself, I guess, because that, you know, that's what art does, and both music and books are, of course, art, and they are a way for us to relate to the world and to ourselves, and maybe, you know, find the truths about the world and ourselves that are difficult to put into direct words. That's kind of what you do with, you know, music and with literature. You speak truths that cannot be put into like plain language often in a lot of ways. So I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's what we'll do. Have fun. I worry this will be very long. And we'll start with the first one. But before we can get there, I think, so like obviously it takes a while sort of like for us to develop like our own sort of like taste of music. Sometimes older siblings or so can have like a profound influence. I am the oldest kid in my family. I have like one younger sister, so I did not have that aspect. So it's very much sort of like that moment when you step out of like what is played in your parents' house, in this case in my mother's house, to find other things and go, you know, and build and start focusing on your own sort of taste, musical taste. And I think in my case I was somewhere around like age 12, 13-ish. And we'll get to the song that I've picked there in a second. I feel like one thing that is important to understand, and that I have come to understand about myself, and that does influence like how I engage with art in general and with music and literature in particular, is the sort of like social background of my family. And there's a term in German that I don't think has an English equivalent, but that is very, very specifically a German thing in a lot of ways, and that has had a massive impact on who I am, for better or for worse, right? The German term for that is Bildungsbürgertum, which basically might be educated bourgeoisie, I guess, and it's a very specific sort of middle class, part of the middle class in like German speaking society that does not necessarily value or prioritize monetary wealth and so forth as like status symbols, but education, higher education in particular. So it's, you know, a lot of people, you know, listening to classical music, reading literary classics, that kind of stuff being like a big part of sort of like the identity of the self-image in a lot of ways. And that is very much where I come from, in for better or for worse. Like both my parents went like university degrees, and my mother even has a PhD in law. So that is what I grew up with like classics in all kinds of ways as a kid. That meant, for better or for worse, that like a lot of classical music in my young childhood, by my mother and my sister played violin in orchestras and everything. So I grew up with a lot of like classical music, and we'll come back to that later on. And it has certainly had a massive impact that I definitely benefit from. Or nowadays, I think it it took me a while to realize that and actually appreciate that. But we will come back to that. So once I started to listening to like my own sort of like music and define my own musical taste, after just basic stuff that was playing on the radio, the first sort of like this deliberate sort of picking of like a musical taste was obviously the absolute fucking opposite. By which I mean punk rock. And that has certainly stayed with me, and I think it also explains a lot about sort of like my general sort of dispositions when it comes to politics and stuff like that. I was like 12 or 13 when a friend at school gave me a cassette tape that they had copied from presumably someone else's cassette tape, because the sound quality was insanely bad. And that was the album called Slime 1 by a German punk band called Slime that has been around since like the 1980s, since like 1980-ish. It's very, very primitive punk rock. It used to be very, very primitive. It has certainly, the sound has somewhat changed. It was back in the day a very, very political band, insanely political. The album has such memorable songs as, ACAP, which might be, like Slime might be the band that brought that slogan to Germany, where it definitely has taken root as like everywhere else. So that is on there. There's another song called Polizei SAS, which compares the police to the SA and the SS, which you see where this is going, right? And the song that I picked is the song that got this album actually banned in Germany. It's currently banned in Germany. It cannot be sold. There's like two ways of banning media in Germany. One is like putting it on a list that you can only sell it sort of like without advertising it, like under the table to people over 18. And then there's stuff that is completely banned, and that is usually, political stuff that tries to destroy the German constitution, which is usually very far left or very far right stuff. And Slime 1 obviously is very much on the far left, and the song is called Bullenschweine, which, means cubs are pigs, basically. And it does have literal like description of like how to build Molotov cocktails and stuff in the lyrics. It's a very simple song, but that's one of the first like punk rock songs I listened to when I was like 12 or 13 years old, and it has stuck with me. So I figured I'll put that one in there because it does explain a lot about me, I think. And it is, this will be sort of like a through line through all of this. It's a very simple song. It's a very direct, emotional kind of song, right? It's anger. It's in your face. It's physical, extroverted in a lot of ways. And I think that is, up to a point, a reaction to growing up in this very specific sort of like highly educated sort of like background in a lot of ways, where a lot of stuff is more rational and more like cerebral and all of that. So it was very much a reaction against that. So I figured that's a great start to pick to get started with. I've linked it down below. Like all of these songs are in the description, so you can listen to all of them if you want to, but you obviously don't have to. So that's the first song that I've picked, and I think it. If you were wondering when I ever turned so far left political, yeah, at age 12, I guess. But let's move on to the second song here. And the second song is sort of that step that, a lot of people at the time, I think, that I grew up with, like, kind of took. It's like you start out with, like, punk rock, and at some point you start to listen to, like, more elaborate, more complex kind of punk rock and so forth. The jump like from like German very simple political punk rock to say your California punk rock, your Bad Religion, that kind of stuff. And then like a next logical step for a lot of people, I think, was to move over to heavy metal. And I picked a specific one here. I could have picked like so many. I know, big surprise, right? But I picked a song by a German band called Blind Guardian, which has had like huge impact on like fantasy tabletop role-playing game nerds and general nerds in Germany and I guess in Europe in a large way. That is Blind Guardian, and I picked a song that was like probably from the second album I heard of them. And that is, of course, the song called Time Stands Still at the Iron Hill from the album called Nightfall in Middle-earth. And yeah, that's the point. It's an entire concept album that tells the story of the Noldor as told in The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. And at that point, when I was like 15, 16-ish, I had read The Hobbit, I had read The Lord of the Rings, and I had read The Silmarillion at that point, and that a band that plays like very still like fairly heavy rock music could like actually spend an entire hour or so to just sing about that one specific book really impressed me at the time. And I've stayed a fan of theirs ever since. I've seen them so many fucking times live. The last one was earlier this year, like in fact, like last month at the Summer Breeze Open Air. And yeah, still very much, even though I don't necessarily listen to their stuff all the time, I'm still very, very much like, they start playing and I know the songs by heart. I can sing those along forever. And Time Stands Still at the Iron Hill is, of course, the story when the High King of the Noldor at the time really had enough and decided to fight Morgoth, Melkor, in, well, single combat in a duel, and he obviously Melkor wins, but it's a massive thing, and he hurts Melkor severely, and that's what the song is about. And I'm a nerd, and that's, I guess, where you have the first sort of like crossover between my reading tastes and my musical tastes in that regard, with something like Nightfall in Middle Earth and Blind Guardian, and that specific sort of form of heavy metal music that has this sort of like overlap with the fantastic in a lot of ways. And there's something there in general that I try to figure out later on that I think is important, and it's both like interesting and threatening, or at least dangerous in some way as well, and that is sort of the sort of like common sort of like heritage in the romanticist tradition, like 19th century romanticism, and there's a lot of like troubling elements to that. But that's sort of like the second song that I picked, Time Stands Still at the Iron Hill. Now let's move on from there to the third pick. Remember how I said that I started out with, like, as a child, like, had like a lot of contact with like classical music? Well, after, starting to, go into like punk rock and then heavy metal, I slowly started to reconcile with that, and, sometimes actively or less, consciously listen to forms of classical music again myself. And, over the years, I've seen a lot of like classic operas in opera houses, including all four operas of Wagner's Ring Cycle and some others. I think like one of the first ones that I saw was Karl Maria von Weber's Der Freischütz, which is a fantasy story with, making pacts with the devil to have bullets that you can definitely always win, and stuff like that. It's a really cool, like, 19th century romantic opera. So a lot of that stuff kind of stayed with me. The song that I've picked here, however, is The Swan of Tuonela by Jean Sibelius, a Finnish composer in the late 19th century. It's one part of the Lemminkäinen suite. Sibelius, obviously, also the composer of the Finlandia theme that you may or may not have heard in. And there's several reasons why I picked this specific one. First of all, I like it. It's a really nice, memorable song. It's probably the most famous next to Finlandia of Sibelius compositions. But it's sort of like the stuff that I kind of got in at that time, which is what you might call either symphonic poetry or program music, by which I mean it's instrumental classical music of the late 19th century that does already move towards like telling a narrative in sound. There's the Per Gynt suite by Edvard Grieg in Norway, for example, taking the Per Gynt stories and setting them to music and stuff like that. There is this one. There is Gustav Holst's The Planets, and a lot. What is interesting about that, and I think partly what made that interesting to me, is that it is like a form of narrative, but classical music, which is not yet fully there, where you have like soundtracks, which is something that a lot of people listen to nowadays, where you kind of have the images at the movie sort of like tied to specific melodies. So it's really easy to sort of listen to that and have, those images in your head. It's one step before that. You kind of need to conjure up those images yourself, but if you already know sort of like what the larger sort of like story or whatever it is that this music is built to or composed to, it's easier to create that, because listening to like older classical music, Baroque or whatever you have, right, can be much more difficult, because it's a very different approach to creating music. And so this is somewhere in the middle, and I picked The Swan of Tuonela because it's from the Lemminkäinen suite, which is based on the Kalevala. The Kalevala being, of course, a collection of Finnish folk stories set into poetry by Elias Lönnrot in the mid-19th century. It's part of that, once again, romantic movement, national romantic movement, when Finland was at the time, well, the official language was Swedish. The country was belonged to Russia at the time, so it's very much the idea of building and creating a Finnish identity, which comes with collecting folk tales the same way that, say, you have the first collection or publication of the Mabinogion when it comes to Welsh identity. It's something that a lot of groups had in the 19th century, and obviously the other point here is that Tolkien was very much impressed by the Kalevala. In fact, he took one story, the story of Kullervo, which is also in the Kalevala, and turned it into the story of Turin Turambar in, well, the Silmarillion, which is sort of the connection that I have here. It made it more easy for me to get back into that and find ways that I could justify it to myself. I'm well, I like this because of these things, and totally not because it's something I grew up with. So that's how I sort of found my way back into these things, into classical music up to a point, and that's why I picked the Swan of Tuonela, which is, of course, Tuonela being the land of the dead in that part of the Finnish mythology, and Lemminkainen has to go there to hunt the Swan of Tuonela to, bring it back to marry the daughter of the old lady of the Northlands, and it's a whole thing. And if you have not read the Kalevala, I highly recommend reading it. It's absolutely fantastic. There's some pretty good modern translations out there. It's really cool stuff in all kinds of ways, and you'll learn a lot about the influences it has on, say, people like Tolkien. Why is Tom Bombadil singing so much? And the answer is in the Kalevala, for example. So yeah. So I picked that one. And one of the things that I feel is interesting sort of about my musical growth or development at the time is how I sort of go from one... I start out with rock music, by which I mean punk rock, and then the slightly more complex stuff with heavy metal, and then I sort of branch out into stuff that is either more, step back into these different sort of things that have had an influence on that sort of kind of music. And one way of going there is, of course, folk rock, and also more 70s folk rock and so forth, which is why the next song that I've picked is one by Jethro Tull, which is definitely one of my favorite bands ever since I first discovered them. Don't get me wrong, I love bands like Uriah Heep and Deep Purple and so forth as well, but Jethro Tull has always had a special place in my heart, because it has, it has elements of folklore, it has elements of rock music, it has very socially aware, almost, sometimes very explicitly political lyrics that are clever when it comes to wordplay and stuff like that. Ian Anderson's certainly one of the best lyricists that rock music has ever had. Also a very interesting interview partner. I got to interview him once. Luckily, the tape got lost, so I did not publish it because, holy shit, that was some of that was not exactly printable, but a very interesting conversation partner nevertheless. The song that I picked here is Heavy Horses from the album Heavy Horses, which is definitely one of the more folk heavy albums, sort of the folk trilogy, with this one and Stormwatch and whatever the other one is that I can't remember right now, but the more folk heavy ones versus the more proggy stuff that you have with a Passion Play and stuff like that before. And I picked Heavy Horses because I like it. It's a really good song. It has that sort of nostalgia element in it of looking back to the time when you still used heavy horses for agriculture and stuff like that. And there's questions of should we maybe keep that around because technology might not last forever. There's a lot of stuff in there. It's also just a really, really catchy song, and I'm a horse person. My family's had horses for a while. My sister is a veterinarian. I've had years of lessons in horse riding. I've done horse riding a lot over the years. I love it. I like horses, is my point. So it does add to that as well. And I've said this before, I've done a horse riding trip around the fjords of Iceland once, and the feeling of if you're riding in a group and you have another sort of herd of backup horses basically with you, and you gallop down a valley towards the sea, and with 50, 60 horses all galloping, and you can feel the ground shaking. It's a very, very impressive feeling that is very difficult to describe, the same way if you have a really open country before, a field that has been mowed down or whatever, right? And you gallop over that with a horse and on a horse, and you give the horse its reins, and that horse just like speeds up. It's hard to describe that feeling. It's impressive. I love it. Heavy horses obviously don't do that because they're, heavy horses that are used to drag trees and plows and stuff like that. But, that's why I picked heavy horses. I love it. You should definitely check out more Jethro Tull if you can and if you want. So that's another one that I picked here. And to continue that, we'll keep going down. First we'll go into the opposite direction, and that is like the more rocky direction. Because when you look at, say, the Blind Guardian song that I picked there, it's still like a fairly well-produced kind of piece of music. And there's another sort of like direction that heavy metal took. It's an older one. It's old school underground stuff, often called epic metal at the time. And the band that I picked here is one of my favorite bands of all time, one that has had like a massive impact on me as a person. Met the main man, guitar player and singer when he was still alive. He sadly passed away right after a concert a couple of years ago where I was. The band is, of course, Manila Road from Wichita, Kansas. And the song that I picked is is the song Necropolis. It's probably one of their most popular ones. And there's a line in there about what he finds in the palace of Atlantean kings, the magic trident of Velusia sees. And if you wonder what Velusia is, then yeah, that's the country that Call of Atlantis is king of in the Call of Atlantis stories by Robert E. Howard. So we have the next sort of like crossover to in this case, the Robert E. Howard pulp era pulp fiction, sword and sorcery stuff, something that I read at the time. So having music that kind of fits that more raw, sharp-edged sort of like unfinished style of the sword and sorcery genre in like music is something that you see with a band like Manila Road. And I picked Necropolis because it is very catchy in its very raw production and everything, and I picked that one for that. And from there, I think the next step that I took and I wanted to take here is to like actual folk. Because when you take something as highly produced as, say, Jethro Tull, with its connections to folk music, and you tie that with, you add like a more raw, direct sort of like element to that, what you get is your 60s and 70s acid folk, something that I love a lot. Like, I could have picked so many bands here, like Fairport Convention, Griffin for like really more like medieval style folk music. There's a lot of stuff going down that specific road. The song that I picked here, for personal reasons, is Hunting Song by a band called Pentangle. I like it for a number of reasons. Like, the production is interesting, the sort of like really progressive psychedelic elements that they add to the sound, especially what they do with like the bass, is impressive as fuck. But it's also interesting because a lot of like what you have with that 60s and 70s folk music is that you have people going into archives and finding old songs, researching old songs and setting them to new versions of music and adding sort of like the elements of the 1960s musical and social sort of like upheavals and adding those in a very specifically British way and setting them to a lot of those older songs that have, because they're folk songs, right? They often had like a root in political and social unrest and the suffering of the common people in a lot of ways. So adding that in there, that dimension in there, is always like a really interesting aspect to a lot of that folk music. I love that a lot. I picked Hunting Song for a second reason here, and that is you have like a sort of like choral part near the end, and that is one that I also know from like a German song, a German harvest song that is called Heo Spann den Wagen an. And as a kid, I went to school at a Waldorf school, like the Rudolf Steiner anthroposophical school, and those are difficult to deal with. I had a lot of fun there at the time, but that whole movement has some weird ties to some, weird German elements of German romanticism and German nationalism and a lot of that, which meant that we did sing a lot of like old German folk songs. And the problem with those is that some of them are absolutely beautiful, but German folk culture in a lot of ways was obviously taken over, occupied, and thus made unusable afterwards by the fucking Nazis. So there's always associations between those schools nowadays, and the political right, the more like anti-vax, weird, sort of like conspiracy theory, weird right-wing in a lot of ways. And that is true in some cases. I did not observe that as a kid there, but it has certainly made me very wary to sort of like come to terms with those elements of like German culture in a lot of ways. So this English song does also remind me of that, and it's one of the ways that I realize that, you know, some of those older German folk songs are just also like really, really beautiful and melancholy in a specific way as well. And that's the reason why I settled for Hunting Song by Pentangle. But really, there's so much more of that kind of stuff that you could pick. And so I did pick another one that is slightly beyond that, and that is in the same sort of style, but also already adding elements of rock music again, and that is from a band called Fotheringay. Fotheringay is absolutely brilliant, amazing. It's the band that a singer called Sandy Denny started with her partner at the time after she left Fairport Convention. And these are songs with lyrics written by her, composed by her, but they take a lot of like that folk styling. And the song I picked here is Winter Winds. It's a relatively short one, but it has this very unusual sort of like structure. There's no like chorus or anything of the sorts. And the very intense lyrics, I think, work wonderfully with the production and, of course, with Sandy Denny's incredible voice. Probably one of the best, if not the best singer in like English folk that ever lived. Sadly, she passed away very young. You should definitely check out whatever else she's done. And one of the interesting things here to bring like back another like book recommendation that I always bring up is Wilding Hall by Elizabeth Hand, which is heavily inspired by sort of like the career of Fairport Convention in a lot of ways, and turns it into a bit of a ghost story in the 1960s with lots of drugs and rock and roll and fairies. And if that's not something to like, I don't know what is. But that's why I picked Winter Wind by Fotheringay. It's deeply sad as a song, but also empowering, and I just love it. Speaking of deeply sad and empowering, there's another one that I picked because I did also slowly venture forth into the American singer-songwriter folk tradition, and there's like one person I love to listen to, and that is Townsend Zand. Townsend Zand obviously being the most depressing in a lot of ways singer-songwriter. Once again, one of those really tragic characters over the years. Wrote a ton of songs, never got like really popular in a lot of ways. A lot of his songs got popular once they got, you know, covered by other people. The song I picked here is Waiting Around to Die. The version I picked is from a documentary, Heart Won Highways, where he plays these songs in the wild, so you can see him in the 60s or early 70s play this song. It's a depressing song in all kinds of ways, but it's, you know, it's that sort of like form of authenticity in there that I really, really appreciate, where you can feel that, you know, this is who he is in a lot of ways. And that possibly apocryphal quote where he was asked why he plays such sad songs. He's like, my songs are not sad, my songs are hopeless. And that is kind of the Townsend Zand thing for me. It's like, you know, Johnny Cash is very, very clean cut compared to something like Townsend Zand, and I hope that some of you will check out some of his stuff. But yeah, be forewarned, it is not for the faint of heart in that regard. But I do very much appreciate a lot of the things he's done. I just had to pick one of those. So here we go. Let's move on from that to sort of like the final couple of songs here. And let's slowly move back towards heavy metal in a lot of ways and keep that romanticism in our hearts. So the next song that I picked is by a German band, and that band is called Atlantean Codex. The song is called 12 Stars, and an Azure Gown, an anthem for Europa, and it's an epic metal song. It takes a lot of like Greek mythology, Roman mythology, images of mythology, but it ties them to the continent of Europe right now, possibly European unification, or at least finding commonalities and so forth. And I've picked it for a number of reasons. One of them is, as I said, like that you have this thing with romantic movements in the 19th century that a lot of them are tied to sort of like the formation of nation states, and that makes them very dangerous and easy to abuse by a lot of people over time. And And this song, I think, does cover that in a lot of ways, because you can listen to this song and make it like a very sort of like Fortress Europe, let's keep migrants out kind of song, which it is not, right? But you can turn it in that direction, because that's sort of like underlies a lot of these dangers, and having like a speech by Winston Churchill cut into the song does add to that. But it is also like, incredibly catchy, and I remember seeing that played live at a concert in Athens right around the whole like financial crisis in Greece and so forth, and having people from all kinds of Europe like sort of like working together, singing together to sort of like go like, no, we won't let the financial system and the monetary system and the politicians sort of like take us apart and put one against each other in this situation, was like a very empowering kind of thing. So it is that sort of like tension between the empowering elements of like the romantic movements in a lot of ways, and the dangers that are inherent in that. And there's a good argument to be made about like how the Romantics obviously influenced fantasy and heavy metal and a lot of other things, and how that can sort of like turn into some very dark places that might be worth a whole video of its own. Spoiler, it will turn to anti-Semitism, of course it will, in the future, but I think it's something that I've been wrestling with for like a long time, sort of sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously, and that's one of the reasons why I put this in here. Also, it's just like a really good song in a lot of ways, and I love that, right? So that's another song that I picked here. There's just 3 more to go, and we're coming sort of like to where I'm at now. The last 3 songs are relatively new songs from the last couple of years, and that sort of like showcase like different elements of like what I'm wrestling with these days in all kinds of ways. And the first one here is a song from a Swedish melodic death metal band. I've been a fan of Dark Tranquillities for a long time. This is from their latest album, and the song is called Not Nothing, because, yeah, it's that existentialist kind of questions like, what if, everything's shit and there is no higher power, there's nothing out there. It's like, how do we deal with that? And the sometimes like violent in sound quality, in sound and production and whatnot, like violent, just like assertion, we are not nothing, we got to make our mark and so forth. I think that is something that I'm wrestling with in a lot of ways, and that some of the books that I read wrestle with, and some of the music I listen to, that making just like asserting that we are alive and that we are here right now, and it's up to us to actually make these things work in a lot of ways. That is at the core of Not Nothing. And I think it speaks to me in a lot of ways. That's why I picked it. Another one that I picked, and that might surprise you, is something musically very different, and that is the Monika Roscher Big Band. It's a German jazz big band that does interesting things. The song I picked is A Taste for the Apocalypse, which, looks at like digital technology, and, we've been talking about artificial intelligence and stuff recently, and I think it looks at that in obviously a relatively depressing sort of like way. I like it because what that band does is like it takes the classical big band sound and adds some electronics and some other things. When it comes to rhythms, they often add like stuff that comes more from like a progressive metal background and really weird things, and sort of like pushes the envelope of what is possible there and crosses into other sort of like genres. And that's something I always appreciate when people take a form, whether it's fantasy literature, whether it's science fiction literature, whether it's any form of literature, or whether it's any form of music, and push the boundaries and go into other places and see what else is possible if we don't adhere to like genre boundaries or anything of the sorts. And that's something that I really appreciate about the Monika Roscher Big Band. And yeah, as I said, like A Taste of the Apocalypse, it's sad, but it looks at like alienation through technology in a lot of ways, and that's something that we all deal with, especially while making videos for the internet. And one final song, and that's like from this year. It's from the band Propagandhi. They're a Canadian punk band, so the circle slowly closes. We started with punk rock, we end with punk rock. It's a far more musically sophisticated form of punk rock, with some elements from heavy metal and hardcore in there. The song is called At Peace, and it's very much, fits the times that we live in, and the question like, how do we live with that? And the lyrics are very powerful. The music is very powerful. Yeah, I wish I was at peace. Maybe I am sometimes, give or take a fit of blinding rage. I think that is very, very expressive. And yeah, that's where I am in the year 2025. And hopefully through all of these like songs, you've sort of seen who I am. And I think in a lot of ways what you see is me wrestling with these sort of like elements, the more like cerebral stuff from a sort of like family background in a lot of ways, and the more aggressive, more coming from like an emotional, intuitive, gut sort of like rebellious side, and those two things often clash in how I want to present myself, how I present myself, because I have that elitist background, can't do much about it, but I understand that it kind of is wrong, because it is an elitist thing, it's privilege, and I don't like that, and it's something that I constantly wrestle with, and I think that sort of like being torn kind of thing comes through in my musical tastes in a lot of ways. So yeah, I hope this was not too long. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you maybe found at least one or two new songs that you might actually enjoy. I'll be talking about books tomorrow or so. I don't know, like, subscribe, comment. I really don't know who to tag, because I always tag the same people, but well, let's do that. Liam, I tag you because I know you have like music tastes and whatnot. So Liam, I tag you. Kitty from Kitty and Her Books, I'll tag you. And I guess I'll tag Lily at Lily's Library, because Lily has been talking about music in her videos, and we appreciate that as well. So here you go, 3 tags. Anyone else who wants to talk about music, go ahead, do this. I'll see you very soon. Until then, be good people. Thanks and cheers.